Kindertransport, German for children's transport, was an organized rescue effort of children from Nazi-controlled territory that took place in 1938 to 1939, during the 9 months prior to the Second World War. The United Kingdom took in nearly 10,000 children, most of them Jewish, from Germany, Austria, occupied Czechoslovakia, and the Free City of Danzig. The children were placed in British foster homes, hostels, schools, and farms. Often they were the only members of their family who survived the Holocaust. The program was supported, publicized, and encouraged by the British government, which waived the visa immigration requirements that were not within the ability of the British Jewish community to fulfill. The British government placed no numerical limit on the program. It was the start of the Second World War that brought it to an end, by which time about 10,000 Kindertransport children had been brought to the country. One of the children rescued by Kindertransport was a 13-year-old girl named Hanni Schlimmer, or, known later by her married name, Hannah Schild. She lived with her parents in Berlin, and this is her story.
I was born in Berlin, 1926, and neither my father nor my mother came from Berlin. My father came from somewhere along the Polish corridor and settled in Berlin, and my mother came from Baden, and they found each other somehow, and I was their only child. I spent the first 13 years of my life in Berlin. I went to a number of schools. I guess I must have entered my first school in 1932, and that was a Christian school. It was a Christian elementary school, and I just loved it. And everybody was incredibly friendly to me, and my parents were very surprised because when 33 came and 34 came and 35 came, they were worried lest I encounter any antisemitism. But I assured my parents that everybody was really friendly, the teachers liked me, and I had a lot of Christian friends as well as Jewish friends. My mother's father had been in a village cantor and teacher. He was extremely Orthodox, and he raised his 5 children in a very Orthodox manner. But when my mother moved to Berlin and encountered different kinds of people, she sort of slipped away from the Orthodoxy and joined a Reformed temple, like my father. And they observed the most prominent holidays of the year. I remember going to temple with them in Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And we did say outside, of course, and Passover Seders were celebrated at our house. But basically, neither my father nor my mother were expressing any Orthodox ideas about Judaism. My mother's family, that is, the sons and daughters of this rabbi in the village, were more or less Orthodox, as long as the grandparents were around to watch it. As soon as my grandparents died, they all left the faith. I mean, they didn't baptize, but they just weren't consciously Orthodox. And I had a lot of uncles, aunts, and cousins. I was the only child, though, and in our family, people didn't seem to have more than one child. So I didn't have that many cousins, both on my mother's side or on my father's side. Mm-hmm. But we were indeed a very extended family. We tended to spend Passover together and pay each other visits on holidays. We were always in touch by telephone. And my father's family was mostly in Berlin, as well as he, for the same reasons, having left the Polish corridor. And then my father settled down in Berlin and practiced law. I loved going to religious school. And there was a wonderful teacher whose name was Dr. Caro, a female, who taught me everything I knew about Judaism that I didn't get at home. I looked forward to going to Hebrew school. I know this sounds silly, but I actually looked forward to it. I gradually encountered antisemitism. I think it must have been around, I was 6 in 32. And it wasn't until I was 10 or 11, which was 1938, 37, that I very much encountered anti-Semitism. My former playmates cut me dead on the street, didn't say hello, and the teachers were not very friendly. And when I reported this to my parents, they said, it's getting to you now, is it? And then they switched me to a Jewish private school in Berlin. You know, nobody in our family immigrated. My grandfather, this very pious Orthodox rabbi, said that he would like nothing better than to be buried in Israel. One of his sons did go to Israel in 1933, but we all thought he was crazy. And my grandfather visited him once at an advanced age and said much as he would love to be buried in Israel, he could not imagine living a life in Israel the hardship that he encountered and the difficulties of living in a land such as Palestine. So he returned, and only to die in Berlin. He died when I left for Brussels. He died 1939. And a natural death, yes. And his wife had preceded him to death shortly before. And my mother did not want him to be alone in that very anti-Semitic village, so she brought him to Berlin. And I had left Berlin, and he got my room. It's nice for me to imagine that he was sitting at my desk studying the Talmud, and he was going to the Orthodox shul around the corner, near where we lived on the Bayerischer Platz. There were a number of temples, Orthodox, conservative, that my grandfather chose the very, very Orthodox ones. My maiden name was Schlimmer, which means worse in German, and my mother's maiden name was Scheuermann. Everybody laughed, of course, about my maiden name, and I asked my father, what kind of a silly name do I have to run around with? And he said, well, that was the revenge of the Germans on the Polish Jews. They said, we can't think of a worse name to give you, so we'll think of it as the worst name. But my father didn't have the option to change it, and I guess I just inherited it. At school, I was not the only Jewish girl, but at the same time, I didn't seek out other Jewish children. I would play with the kids that lived near me. We'd go home from school together, and we'd spend the afternoon together. And I even remember one of my friends, it turned out that her father was a big wheel in the Nazi party. And my father knew of him, and my father didn't try to influence me, didn't say don't play with her anymore, but then she dropped me, and the problem was solved. I ended up feeling very, very abandoned. I felt very abandoned. I am a child. If I were to look at a child today, I would realize this is rejection. This is total rejection, and certainly not deserved rejection. So I felt pretty rotten. But as soon as I entered my Jewish school, I was on cloud nine and loved it. I just loved it. And I just abandoned the whole connection with the Christian world of that neighborhood. I did not discuss this at home with my parents. Not much. As little as possible. They wanted to spare me to talk about my feelings. I think it was just internalized. I think that I internalized that and had to deal with it on my own. My parents were not going to discuss it with me. They immediately said, life has changed for us and we better make the adjusting to it.
Meine Arbeit für richtig hältst, ob du glaubst, dass ich fleißig gewesen bin, dass ich
We did listen to Hitler's speeches, however. We were roaring with laughter and amusement at this madman. And that was the whole problem. My parents didn't think this madman was going to last. Therefore, they did not make many attempts at immigration. Because most of their friends, just like my parents, were educated people, and they had been in the Weimar Republic, and they knew that governments came and went. And someday this madman was going to be deposed. So they didn't pay too much attention to it. But I personally remember that when I was in the Jewish school, every day, one or the other of my classmates would say, we're going to America next week, or we're going to Poland, because some of the specific big girls had Polish parents. And you may know that the Poles were repatriated approximately 1938. And one girl in particular that I loved, who was dressed beautifully, and whose father's chauffeur dropped her off at school, told me that she was going to Warsaw next week, and I envied her. I thought it was wonderful to be able to leave Germany and go to Warsaw. At a certain point, of course, my family started very indirectly talking about leaving Germany. My mother had a cousin from southern Germany who lived in Antwerp, and my mother had heard that there were several children's transports leaving Berlin and other German parts to all kinds of places like Sweden, England, France, and finally Belgium. So she requested my cousin, a second cousin, to find out what on earth did one have to do to get a child into a children's transport to Belgium. He did the best he could. He contacted the committee in Brussels, and they initiated a procedure where I was going to be on a certain children's transport in May 1939. But it was very indirect. My mother told me later that she did not consult me. She made that decision with my father on their own. I was the only child, and they wanted me in safety. And the only person who talked to me about this was a very favorite aunt with whom I spent many, many hours, who was widowed and had no children. And one afternoon, I went to see my aunt at the Tiergarten, and she said,
"Let's go for a walk."
And all of a sudden she said,
"It's not very easy being a Jew in Germany, is it?"
And I said, "It's all right. It's okay." And she said,
"Would you feel abandoned if your parents were to think of a place where you could hide in safety until this war is over?"
And I took a step back and said, "What?"
"Yes, actually. The whole family has been talking about trying to get you out because your parents evidently aren't going to make it. So the least thing we can do is send you out. But you're their only child, and it's a big sacrifice on their part."
And again, I took a step back, and I had to think about that for a while. Can't wait to go. But my parents never talked about getting me out of Germany. Not until it was a fait accompli that the tickets were there and I had a medical examination. Then finally we got some clothes. My mother had some clothes made for me. And then at that point we were ready to talk about my departure, which, if I had said I don't want to be with my parents, I don't think they would have sent me. So I finally left Germany in May 1939. I'll never forget the day I left Germany. I just had a letter from a friend who happens to live in a kibbutz in Israel, and he came from Berlin, and I was in the same compartment with him. And he just remembered after 50 years how I took him on my lap because he was vomiting from the emotional drain of saying goodbye to his parents at the quay of the train. I too had said goodbye to my parents. But I was not emotionally drained. He was. He was very, very upset. And I was delighted to hear from him. I'd been in touch with him for many years, but he said, this is an early memory. Leaving home was painful, that there was Hannah, and she took care of me while I was crying my heart out, and then he vomited. I remember vividly that it was the first time that I had an opportunity to help a contemporary, like a mother, I was extremely attached to my father, less so to my mother. My mother was a very weird woman. She probably wasn't perfect for mothering, that she was a singer and a legal secretary for my father. And she preferred not to have anything to do with me. She had nannies for me or gouvernante, whatever one called it then, so she could dedicate herself to her work and to her leisure activities, which involve singing in choirs and so forth. There wasn't that great a relationship between me and my mother, but there was a tremendous attachment to my father, overcompensating, I guess. And I do remember being torn between having a way out or staying behind and being with my father. And I guess the survival instinct in me won over. I missed my father terribly. But when my aunt had said, you may be getting to survive this way, that my instinct was to take what was offered to me and to leave my father behind, which was a little bit selfish, I guess.
And then came Kristallnacht, the night of November 9th to 10th, 1938, when German Nazis attacked Jewish persons and property. The name Kristallnacht refers ironically to the litter of broken glass left in the streets after these pogroms.
My parents started thinking more and more about leaving Germany. When did, at a certain stage around Kristallnacht, when definitely made plans. And we did have some relatives in America who were willing to give us affidavits. And my father was on a Polish quota, which was overcrowded, and their number just didn't come up until 1941. I remember Kristallnacht. My father was out of the apartment, and the Gestapo came to the door, and my mother was home, and said, my husband is not home just now. What do you want? And they told my mother that they're rounding up all the men to take them to the Gestapo headquarters.
We are looking for Ludwig Schlimmer.
And I was there, and my mother was beside herself, and she said, my husband isn't home. And she showed him all the diplomas and all the certificates and the medals that my father's father had won in the last war. And she said, what do you want from my husband? And they said,
We are rounding up all the men to take them to the Gestapo headquarters.
I was there when this happened, when my mother again went into hysterics, and I tried to soothe her. And my father came home, heard about this. He had heard that the men were being rounded up. And instead of fleeing, he went. He went because he was a lawyer, and he believed in the letter of the law, regardless of what was going to happen to him. And then another miracle happened. He was there for 12 hours. And my mother was quite incapable of dealing with that. And her sister, who had lived in Berlin near us, was a very tough lady, very earthy, savvy kind of a woman. And she said, let me take over. And she went to the Gestapo headquarters, a very good-looking woman, by the way. And she raised a ruckus that Dr. Schlimmer is held here against his will, and that he has never done anybody any harm, and there was no cause for them to arrest him and to take him to Sachsenhausen, which they did with everybody else, and to release this man. And they said, why should we make any exceptions? And she went to hell and told them off. And after 12 hours, she managed to get that man out of there. So she just died recently, and my warmth towards her has always been very intense. I don't remember the actual night, but I remember the day after, because my mother was having hysterics, and my father usually called my aunt, the one that I confided into, and said, would you take the child for just a day? My wife is having hysterics. And I went over to my aunt again in the Tiergarten, and we spent the day, and she explained to me what had happened in the most, in the gentlest way that she could possibly break it to me. And I was in touch with my parents by telephone, and I spent several nights with her because my mother was totally unable to adjust to the situation that followed the Kristallnacht. I remember about my nannies and governesses is always left. As soon as I got adjusted to them and loved them, they would either get married or find a more lucrative job. So that was very painful, very painful. I did have my own room, and I spent a lot of time in my room, and I drew and I read, and I was allowed to come out when my parents had company and would have musical evenings. When occasionally some people would say, "Can't she have dinner with us tonight?" But normally my nanny would bring my dinner to me at my desk in my own room at night. I think we would have been considered middle class because I don't remember my parents having a car, wishing that they had a car, not being able to afford it. I do remember my parents saying, "Oh, we wish we would have a little cottage out of town so we could spend our weekends, but we can't afford it." So they couldn't have been that well off, but they had maids. But we did not have a car. I had pretty much whatever I needed in the way of clothes and books. And my parents went to the theater a lot and to the concerts, and they took trips to various spas all year long. Nevertheless, I was always like my care over nannies. Yes, I did once with my parents to go to Eichholzheim to see my grandparents. But my father always promised, next year I'm going to take Hulam to Italy. My mother would say, "I'll take you to Czechoslovakia," but nobody ever did. Our apartment could be described as a Berliner Zimmer, with a long corridor and the kitchen in the very back. And so by the time the cook brought in the dinner, it was cold. The music room was particularly beautiful. It had a large Steinway in it, and I was never allowed to go into that music room unless they had company. It was very stiff and very formal. We had a lovely big room where my father received his clients that was called, well, his offices were in the apartment. In Germany, if you were a doctor or a lawyer, you usually had your offices. So it was a very attractive apartment in a nice part of town where a lot of well-to-do Jews congregated. And I played on the Bayerischer Platz with most of my Jewish friends. And there was a movie nearby. I was a movie freak, and I always went to the movies with my friends. And it was reasonably happy. It was a nice childhood. It wasn't that marred by the anti-Semitic incidents that I experienced. I overcame that rapidly. Our street was named Westarp. The whole Bayerischer Viertel was named after various. Now, the street that I lived in was named after a Count Westarp. But the other streets were called Marinerstrasse, Augsburger Strasse, Würzburger Strasse. So the whole quartier was called the Bayerische quartier. And I was right in the middle of it, and my friends lived nearby.
Finally, it was time for Hannah to leave Germany, to leave Berlin and her parents, and take a train to Brussels, where the next leg of her journey would happen. Smaller numbers of children were taken in the VIA program by the Netherlands, Belgium, France, Sweden, and Switzerland. The term Kindertransport may also be applied to the rescue of mainly Jewish children from Nazi German territory to the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. An example is the 1,000 Château de la Hire children who went to Belgium.
I remember going over the border, and someone said to us, "We're all out of Germany now." And we all cheered. I don't know if I had a passport or whether I had an exit visa that my parents might have gotten for me. I have no idea. I was only 13. I was not aware of papers and identification or anything like that. I don't know if anybody was in the compartment looking after me. You know that again, I can't recall that. I do know comfortable. It was, I think it was second class. There were a number of us who got on in Berlin, and we were all in the same compartment, whereas next door to us in the compartment, there were a number of kids who only got on at Cologne. The closer we got to Belgium, there were people who got on in Aachen, and then we crossed the border. But who took care of us? I cannot recall. It must have been someone from the committee in Brussels who did this professionally taking children in and out occasionally, but I do not remember a face or a voice or any food given to us. I don't remember anything like that. And when I finally got to Brussels, I was received by the committee. There was several committee ladies. These were wealthy Jewish Brussels residents. They called it the Committee Israélite des Enfants. And they welcomed us very heartily and put us into a bus, and we drove outside of Brussels towards the Flemish countryside. And finally, the bus stopped in front of a large mansion, which actually was called Chateau General Bernheim. And we got out, and I was extremely excited about that because it had a beautiful park and it was very pretty. And there were lots of kids welcoming us who had come there before, and a bunch of teachers who also welcomed us. And I was put into a dormitory with a number of other girls that had been there before, became acquainted with them, and settled in. That's all. It wasn't traumatic. It was rather fun. Still communicated with my parents. But at that time, war hadn't broken out yet. And I had weekly letters. My uncle, or rather my second cousin in Antwerp, was also in touch with them to report that I had gotten there safely. And was there anything that they wanted to have me get from them? He was willing to do whatever was necessary to help the transition. And in the meantime, my parents were in Berlin. They were stamping at the American consulate to get a number, and they conferred with all of their friends about trying to get out of the country. Now, my father at some point then had a visa, I think, for Venezuela and Cuba, and a couple of other Central American countries. But he was told by friends that they were fake, and that the Germans might let him out on the basis of these visas, but he wouldn't be admitted into those countries because these visas were faked. So he discounted that very rapidly and focused in on immigration to America, because that was where our family was, and that was where the relatives were who had come here in 1906, I believe, and who were really very generous and gave a number of visas to members of family one by one. And that is where my parents focused on coming to America. And we sort of had an understanding that eventually I would join, even though I was not with them at the time. My parents left in 1941. That was at a time after I had fled from Brussels, the night after the Nazis invaded. And then I went to the south of France with another children's transport, but under very different conditions, in cattle cars. Then on, I had no more communication with my parents. Nazis invaded Belgium. I remember being very excited about it, being politically totally naive. And somebody saying, war's going to break out. It may affect us. It may affect France. It may affect Holland. I said to myself, I wonder what this is going to do to my parents and me. I remember the night before war broke out, because it was an unbelievably beautiful sunset, and we were all standing together, all the kids and our teachers, looking at this sunset and saying, something ominous is going to happen. Our teachers knew, but they didn't cue us in. Again, they did not cue us in to the danger that was posed by the invading armies. And then the next morning we woke up and we heard the radio, and suddenly Brussels was being bombed, but we were outside of Brussels. We only saw the smoke. But then the teachers had a powwow with the committee, and some very crucial decisions were made very, very quickly to get us onto that train where everybody was going. Everybody was exiting Brussels. Anybody who had the money to have gas for their cars, anybody who had the money for a ticket to the south of wherever in Europe. And it was a pandemonium. extinction. Pandemonium.
After a week traveling through France along with thousands of other refugees from the north, the children arrived in the hamlet of Serres, near to Naillot, in the department of Haute-Garonne, and were lodged in a large barn belonging to the farm of the Château de Serres. There was no furniture or beds and little to eat. The winter of 1940 was very harsh, and there was much illness and suffering. Fortunately, the Secours Suisse aux Enfants, a subsector of the Red Cross of Switzerland, agreed to provision the young refugees' camp and began to supply clothing and basic needs. The following spring, the Swiss organization, directed by Monsieur Maurice Dubois, arranged the transfer of the camp to the Château de la Hille near Pamiers in Ariège. At the time, it was a very neglected building, and the older boys set to work digging wells and latrines to make the old chateau habitable. In the summer of 1941, through the intervention of the American Friends Service Committee, 20 of the youngest children were brought to the United States, and 2 others were saved by relatives in America. One of those children was Hanne Schlimmer.
We had a number of educators that went with us. And they helped us that in the trains. And we were able to bring only very, very little of our personal possessions. I remember I'd packed a bag with some photographs of my parents and my favorite book, I think, and very few clothes and a blanket. That's all I remember, oh man. And the conditions in the cattle train were pretty primitive. There was nowhere we could relieve ourselves. Mm. Food was handed out to us at various stops in the north of France by Red Cross volunteers. And we fell over this food because we hadn't eaten for a number of hours. Sleeping was impossible because there was no space on shore. I do remember that blanket of mine. Actually, I brought it to the United States with me. That's how I slept that night, because I had to put myself in the fetal position and slept on that blanket and woke up the next morning and we were in Toulouse. Of course, we could not look out of the train. There were these little peepholes. And it was particularly difficult because not everybody needed to go to the bathroom when they made a stop. It was particularly hard on the boys. And later, I was talking to one of the boys and I said, well, how did you handle this? He said, well, we just peed out of the window. Mm-hmm. I thought, oh. I just know that it seemed like a day and a night. And lots of confusion. And then someone came and said that the compartment, the part of the railroad in front of us had been bombed because the Nazis were striking with refugees. But ours was not bombed. We were not affected at all. And again, instead of being terrified, I felt really quite calm. I cannot believe today how calm I felt at that time. I cannot believe that I kept my cool under those circumstances. We arrived in Toulouse, which is the département Haute-Garonne, and officials, officially of Toulouse, met us at the railroad. There were some good people who brought food to us. Again, you were put in a truck and driven outside of Toulouse, perhaps 100 miles. And we were deposited in a very small village. But the village had a chateau, very much like the one that we had lived in Brussels, and everybody was really excited and said, oh, wow, we're going to go into another castle. But we were wrong, because the castle was inhabited by the owner of the castle and his wife. And we were quartered in the village, and the village had approximately 150 inhabitants. And they spoke a French patois that we did not understand at all. And the villagers were very passive about this invasion of 100 children. They wouldn't smile at us. Nobody was particularly enchanted to see us, but they accepted us. And the Chatelaine and the Chatelain came over to welcome us, but then we never heard from them again. And we were quartered in the village in various barns without windows. Roll, Toulouse. And we had taken a wonderful woman along from Brussels with her husband and her young son, who did the cooking for us in Brussels, and she became the cook for the Colonie d'Enfants in the south of France. But there was no kitchen. Everything had to be improvised. Latrines had to be dug. There were no bathrooms. And poor Madame Schlesinger had to learn how to cook on a fire for 100 children. And then, of course, there was no food. The French, by this time, had hoarded what there was. And finally, they must have made a request of the American government, but we were sent some supplies, which were dried coffee, dried eggs, dried milk. And later on, the Swiss Red Cross took us on, and they started bringing in more dried supplies. But there was never enough food. They might have gone through the Jewish Committee or the American government. But we didn't know. We didn't know. All the details were left to the educators who corresponded with people, possibly even telephoned. All we knew is we were very, very hungry most of it, and very, very cold, because the south of France can be very cold. It's not in the summer. And not all of us had blankets. Some of us just were lying on the straw, warming one another with our bodies. It was pretty rough. Yeah, it was pretty rough. We had nobody but Austrians and Germans. That's all we had. And we communicated in German. In Brussels, of course, we were taught French, and one device was to say, you mustn't speak any German in order for you to learn enough French. When we came to the south of France, and we had finally been cued in that we were refugees, and we didn't want the villagers to know that we were German, somebody had the bright idea to say, look, speak French. It's obvious that you have a German accent. There's no way that you're going to hide that accent. So if anybody asks you, why don't you say you came from Alsace-Lorraine and you have a German accent? And that's it. And that was a very clever device, because nobody did insist on finding out where we really came from. Because if anybody had wanted to denounce us, they could have. So we spoke French with heavy German accents, and with the villagers we couldn't communicate at all. They were just mired in their native patois, and there was very little communication. Well, our studies, that was a very interesting thing. Many of us wanted to go to America. Some of us wanted to go to Israel. Those who wanted to go to America got together, and we had what was called an English club. And we whispered together. Somebody brought a textbook, and we were learning English together in the meadow somewhere near the chateau. And we had a ball. It was terrific. I remember there were some very Zionist young men and women, and they sat together and studied Hebrew. And they actually did go to Israel afterwards, if they could make it. And the rest of the education is interesting too, because some of us felt that we didn't want to miss being educated. Some of us could care less, and they didn't have to go to class. But the mother of our director, who was an Austrian lady who had been a school teacher before, decided to give evening classes in everything, from literature to philosophy. And those of us who were interested in continuing our education went and were educated by this family, without books, orally, lectures, discussions. And I would say that some of my interest in education stems from that wonderful lady. But as I said, it was not compulsory. Some of us never got an education. Some of us even didn't know how to read literary. Some of the kids who were taken away from their parents when they were very young never learned to be literate. It was really quite remarkable that we found someone to teach us under those circumstances. First of all, it was great for her. It was very therapeutic for her because she was an old lady, and her son was the director of the school, or whatever you want to call the Crimini. And he sent for her. He got her out from Belgium, and she, of course, was beside herself and very, very upset. And so her son thought it would be good therapy for her to become our teacher. And when she had that role, she stopped being so upset. and worrying about the rest of the family who might stay behind in Brussels. So it was good for all of us, her as well as us. And I remember her license with great fondness. She was a really quite an influence. But she wasn't communist. I forgot to say that. She tried to indoctrinate us, but nobody paid much attention to that. We are in 1940. I spent 40 and part of 41 in Toulouse. And the situation got a little bit better. We got sheets to put on our straw mats. The food supply was perking up a little bit. But then the deportation started. The young men in our group who were over 16 were taken away and put into various camps that the French had created for refugees, like Saint-Cyprien and girls. And later, after I left, I was told that even young women over 16 were taken to these camps. And we all got a little bit nervous when that happened. And some of them would be released and tell pretty horrendous tales about these camps, about the lack of sanitation and the lack of food. And suddenly we began to get a little bit more worried about our fate. And at that point, everybody was corresponding with their parents, and all of a sudden the letters would stop, and rumors of people being deported from various cities came out. My parents had written to me the last time they had written to me. They wrote about bombardments in Berlin. And then, at that point, most of us became aware of what was really happening to us. And at that point, I got very depressed and very nervous because I really remembered my father saying, "We'll meet on the way to America," and I didn't think I was ever going to make it. And then, for the first time, I heard the word concentration camp. Detention camp in France, we all knew what that was. Very few people died of starvation, and certainly not of furnaces. The only people who died there were elderly who didn't have the correct medical care, or who would have died anyway. So that was not a concentration camp. I only heard about concentration camps through one of our educators, who, I think I mentioned this at the group the other day, who suddenly got us all together for a special meeting. And we said, "Well, why do we have to have a special meeting?" And she said, "I really have to talk to you because I'd heard some rumors from Eastern Europe that a lot of Jewish people," and she was not a Jew, by the way, she was a good Catholic. A lot of Jewish people had been deported to Poland. And from what she understood, those were extermination camps. And she said, "I'm not certain about this, but save yourselves. Get the hell out of Europe if you can, because the Germans are going to send everybody that they can get their hands on to Poland." So I heard about it, but I didn't believe it. I just didn't believe it. It was hearsay. She had no concrete evidence at all. It was just hearsay, and I did not believe it. At that point, all communication with my parents stopped, except for one wonderful intermediary. My parents had friends in Lisbon, Portugal, and that was a neutral country, so they wrote to these friends. And through Lisbon, we were able to correspond like once every 2 months. We left Toulouse in May 1941, 2 years after I had left Germany. And miraculously, I reestablished contact with my parents, and we had a real date to meet in Bilbao. They sent me enchanted letters from the hotel, which was called Hotel in La Cara, about the wonderful weeks that they spent, eating well and sleeping at night, and surrounded by friends, unique people like them, who were all going to embark on a certain road. And I got very excited in the last episodes. Utopian. If I can just make it, if I can just make that deadline, because there was a deadline. And I remember leading on my friends, and everybody was crying. I mean, I would have been envious of me if I had been one of them. And they were crying, and they were saying, we'll never see each other again. And I felt a little guilty because I was the privileged one. There were a couple of others who followed me, I think. But they were brought over by Americans, and they were put into adoptive families because their own families had perished. But I think I was the first one who left legally, ostensibly, to meet my parents. And I kept saying to myself, why am I so lucky? Why me? So it was a little guilt-ridden. But then as soon as I left, I was given a train ticket. The train ticket consisted of two parts. Part of it was from a little village near the Pyrenees to the Spanish border, and I was to spend the night. And here I was, 15 years old, had never registered in a hotel before. I was to spend the night in a certain hotel and asked the landlord to wake me up at 5 the next morning because my train was leaving. And of course, it was really exciting to be on my own and have a little room with a real bed, no straw, and have coffee next morning, real coffee. And then there was a very funny incident at the railway station when I was waiting for my train to Spain. A group of English men and women were talking and gesticulating very loudly, and since I had learned some English, I was very interested in what they were saying. An elderly gentleman approached me and said, "Are you British?" And I said, "No, I'm Jewish and I'm from Belgium." And he simply walked away from me. So I found that very puzzling. Had I been British, I guess he would have taken care of me. Well, he wanted to know where I came from, but I think my accent gave me away. I think my German accent when I spoke English must have given me away. And then I was on a train. It was a very long ride to Bilbao. I had to pass through Barcelona. And I was just in Barcelona 2 years ago and tried to look up the place where I spent the night, but I couldn't find it. And again, my parents made arrangements with the pension in Barcelona to have me spend the night. And I took the bus. When I got to the Barcelona railroad station, I actually, though I didn't speak a word of Spanish, asked where the number 15 or 17 runs, and I was told to get on that bus and get out at a certain street, go to a certain number of the street, and ring the doorbell because there was a German Jewish lady who had a pension, and she was waiting for me. And I did that. And there she was. And she welcomed me, and she said, "Oh, you're the little girl whose parents are waiting for her in Bilbao. You won't have to take that trip by yourself." There was a dentist and his wife who were in Bilbao, but he briefly had to go to Barcelona on business. He came to the pension to pick me up and take me back with him to Bilbao. And then the dentist and I boarded the train with the itinerary to Bilbao, and we had a lovely talk. They were very nice people and very well dressed, and the woman was beautifully made up, and I looked like something that the cat had wet. I didn't know how dirty I was. I had no idea what my hair looked like. The clothes that I wore were a 2 years old and hadn't been washed very thoroughly. But they put up with me, they were very, very kind. Told me that they admired my carrots. So when we got to Bilbao, there were my parents at the train station. Yeah, it was a miracle of timing. So we were reunited. And they took me to the hotel. And everything was beautiful. Lots of food, lots of clean sheets. My mother had gotten some new clothes for me, made in Berlin, and put these new clothes on me, so I would look like a human being because I was really in a very bad state. Washed me, gave me my first bath in 2 years, and gradually I began to accept everything being okay again. It was a wonderful transition. My father, I remember, didn't have access to cigarettes in Germany for a number of years. And he was standing in line in the tobacco store in Bilbao because he loved cigarettes. He was an addict. And he was absolutely ecstatic, too, about all the possibilities that he had not had. And my mother took the cigarettes away from him as usual. But it was a happy time. It was a very happy time. And we didn't need to learn Spanish because everybody spoke German. Everybody in that hotel spoke German. It was just like living in Washington Heights, you know. And many of the people were very friendly, and had heard my story, and all considered it beautiful. It was May 1941, and we stayed in that hotel for what seemed like an eternity. To me, it seemed like an eternity. It may have been a week or two, but it was an absolutely beautiful, beautiful stay. When I went back to Bilbao some 25 years later, I did not see the hotel. Bilbao had become a very dumpy, dirty harbor town, and everything that I had remembered from 1941 had vanished, and I said to myself, either I was exaggerating it, or it never was like that. It was just the meeting with my parents that was so beautiful. And then we got on the boat. It was called Magallanes. There were a number of boats of that particular maritime company, and many of them were ill-fated. They were overcrowded, bad sanitation. And on our boat, we had typhoid. It was the Spanish Rhine line. It was notorious for overcrowding people into little space. It was notorious for neglect, and yet they were making a lot of money on this. So there was a whole fleet of boats going to America from Bilbao and Lisbon, and all those boats were notorious, but we didn't know that before. How could we? Nobody could know that. Nobody could. My parents were lucky enough to be able to get a lift in Berlin. A lift is a large cargo box, and some of my parents' furniture and paintings came on that lift. And I remember that my father and my mother looked at each other because they had to pay to get the lift sent to America. And they did not have any money. They had like $5 each. Again, nobody had told them this in advance. And they couldn't get hold of that money. And everything that was in their lift was auctioned. And my mother was devastated. My father said, "Look, we're leaving. We're saving our lives. We don't need furniture." I don't think that we had more than maybe $10, the three of us. And my mother kept talking about the furniture. And I thought it insignificant at the time. I said, "It's not important." My father tried to calm down my mother, but she didn't understand. She too focused on that furniture. All I know is that we were to come to America, at least with enough furniture to furnish an apartment. How it happened that it had to be auctioned off, I don't remember. No, I don't remember. They never got a cent. I know nothing about this particular transaction, except that it ended badly. You know, there may have been 1,000 people on the boat. And this was shortly after the Spanish Civil War. And a lot of Spaniards were embarking on that boat to go to Cuba because these were victims of the Spanish Civil War. But they were in steerage. And the German Jews were not. We were in the upper decks, and these poor Spaniards were on steerage. And they didn't communicate. My parents didn't speak any Spanish. They didn't speak any German. So I just remember that we coexisted. We smiled at each other. We just coexisted. It seemed to me that my world was with the German Jews, and their world was down there in steerage. Bethel. but it must have been at least 1,000. And then the boat was not seaworthy, and it kept breaking down. And I think our trip to New York took us 6 weeks instead of 1 or 2, because we kept going to dry docks all over the coast of Spain and the coast of Portugal. Before we went to Lisbon, we must have had at least 6 dry dock stays in the various towns that had dry docks, and the boat was fixed up in a manner of speaking. And it was wonderful being in dry dock, because I remember going on walks. All I know is that we spent a lot of time in Bilbao and in the various cities until we finally got to Lisbon. So it was like a tour of Spain, Spanish coastal towns, and a tour of Portuguese coastal towns. It took us enormously long to reach Lisbon. And in Lisbon, the people who had befriended my parents and who had made communication possible are now the in-laws of Dr. Ruth Westheimer. I didn't know it at the time, and they were wonderful to us. We spent a whole day with them in Lisbon, being wined and dined, and I had a very happy memory of Lisbon. Of course, when the boat left Lisbon, we didn't stop anywhere until we finally got to Havana, Cuba. In the meantime, however, an epidemic of typhoid broke out. And my father was very sick. We did not know it was typhoid, because it was in the interest of the maritime company not to let any such rumors out. So he went to the doctor and he said, I am in agony. I think I have an intestinal infection. And he gave him a shot. And my mother felt sort of rotten. And I was the only one who was well. And I kept ovulating between my compartment with my mother and my father's cabin. And my father had a fever. He was very dull. And I was very frightened. And we didn't know what it was. It was April. It was April because we had Passover on the boat. And my father spoke. There was no rabbi. There were Spaniards and German and Austrian Jews, some of them Hungarian, from various parts of Europe. But we could always communicate. Because I remember I befriended a Hungarian family. They had like 3 or 4 little girls. And they spoke beautiful German, so I was their friend. And I hadn't met that many Austrians before. And I was fascinated by all these different Jewish groups on the boat. And I even remember dancing. I was 15. And they had dances in the evening, and a very handsome young man asked me to dance. I just felt very ecstatic. So I had some good memories as well, until the typhoid struck and things weren't very warm. We couldn't possibly have known it was typhoid. They were keeping it a secret from us, because people would have panicked. Yeah, they would have just panicked. And then we arrived in Lisbon, and we stayed there just one afternoon. What we did in Lisbon, we picked up other passengers. I remember some French Jews who came aboard in Lisbon. And that widened our circle of friends. We were very ecstatic, meeting other people. Like I was the last station in Europe where the boat stopped. And from then on, it was going across the Atlantic. My mother was frightful and seasick most of the time. My father and I were not, so we had a wonderful time together before he got sick. Going all over the decks and growing and having coffee in the salon, listening to the live music being played in the afternoon. But my mother was frightfully seasick most of our cross meet. And wouldn't even show up at dinner. We would have to bring her things to eat. There were 4 or 6 women in my cabin, and there were 4 or 6 men in my father's cabin. It was rather primitive. And she was incredibly sick and said we should have never taken this trip. I knew we were going to come to a bad end. I'll die on this boat, but we all told her it's just seasickness. It's going to be all right. And she was. One thing that happened while she was sick was very interesting. We did have a radio report, We were in communication, probably the BBC. And all of a sudden, my father came to my mother's cabin and said, "Guess what?" And she said, "I don't want to know. I don't want to know." And he said, "Something very important just has happened. Rudolf Hess went to England to arrange some sort of peace." And my mother, who had a good sense of humor, got up from her bed, got dressed, and she says, "What are we having for dinner tonight?" And everybody got very elated at that because they thought peace was near. But we didn't stop anywhere. Now, the boat had suffered from was this epidemic, but it didn't touch everybody. Where they were, when we finally did get to New York, the statistics were in the New York papers. I still have the article here. And they were like perhaps 10 cases of typhoid and 1 death, and the death was very positive. Now, what happened when we got to New York? That he was immediately taken to a hospital, and I didn't see him anymore after that. And my relatives from Atlantic City, who had given the affidavit, sensed that there was going to be a death. And they said, "Look, your wife will stay with her relatives in New York, but I think we'll take the little girl now because she'll be better off without being near you. She'll be with us in Atlantic City, and maybe we'll put her into school and everything will go well." So my mother stayed behind. My father was deadly sick in a hospital. I think he lived for 3 days in America. And I didn't know the first thing what was happening. And nobody told me. Nobody told me. My relatives took off one Sunday afternoon, shortly after I got there. They had a car, and they got a friend to come over to take care of me, take me to the movies, I think. And I said, "Where are you going?" And they said, "Oh, visiting some people in New York." I said, "Why can't I come along?" And they said, "Oh, you'll have much more fun with this person that we've taken on to take you to the movies." And when they came home that night, they looked very depressed. And I sensed something was frightfully warm, and I said, "What happened? Where did you go?" And they told me they had been to a funeral. And I was ranting and raving, and I said, how could you do this to me?" I couldn't say goodbye to my father. And they apologized. They said it was probably all for the best because you would have suffered more effect than there. But I think probably not. All the way not communicating. Again, probably not even sitting down and discussing with one another whether I ought to be given the option to go to this funeral. And my mother was not at the funeral either, because my mother had then been diagnosed with what was called paratyphoid, which was not as serious as what my father had. And she was hospitalized, and I don't think she was told either until she was well enough to receive the news that her husband had died. And when the boat landed in New York, my father walked off the boat. He had a high fever, and we were carrying, sort of holding on to him. We walked off the boat, and we had a large group of people, not only relatives, but German Jewish friends from Berlin, who loved my father. And I sensed that he was very sick. And I had this feeling they were going to take him to the hospital. I think so, yes, because we first spent a night at a hotel called the Manhattan, and he still spent the night with us. And the next morning, I don't recall who it was, somebody said, "This man has to be seen by a doctor immediately." He was taken to the hospital for a checkup, and they kept him right there. And that was when my relatives from Atlantic City said, "Come on, it's better for you to go away from Manhattan at this point." He just had a high fever. People do the best they can under such circumstances. If it had been Ellis Island, he would have never passed. But it was Brooklyn, New York, and maybe they were not conscious of sickness or any. I have no idea, but he passed. But a day after our hotel in Manhattan, he was taken to the doctor, and that was the last time I ever saw him. And I stayed with my relatives in Atlantic City. And they were rather kind people, but not very conscious of what they had done. And they tried to give me a quick education to Americanize me. And it all seemed very, very absurd to me. I didn't feel comfortable. I was missing my father too much. And I didn't like to be with them because they had an epileptic daughter who was making life very, very hard for everybody in the family, including me. And when my mother came out of the hospital, she came to Atlantic City and she said, well, what do you want to do? And I said, please take me away from here. I don't like to live with these relatives. As they also made us feel as though we were a burden to them. So at that point, she had a brother in Omaha, Nebraska, who was a cantor there. And he sent for us. And my mother and I went to live in Omaha, Nebraska with my uncle for about a half a year. And the committee in New York was very much in favor of that because they said there are entirely too many German Jews in the cities. We need to get them in the Midwest. So they paid for everything. And my mother said, okay, we'll try this for a little while. But it didn't work. It didn't work. My mother was most unhappy there. My uncle was not as welcoming as he should have been or might have been. And I think the whole thing lasted for a half a year. I went to school there and liked it very much. I was in a high school, and I was the only foreign person in that class of mine, and they wanted to hear about my experiences, and I told them about it, and they befriended me. I was very, very lucky. So I did really want to leave Omaha, Nebraska, but my mother's was 45 years old. She was a young woman, and she wanted to integrate into a community somewhere, maybe find friends, and maybe marry. Well, she was not happy, so we left. I came back to Manhattan. And then the struggle began for my mother, who had no penny, and she didn't want to be dependent on anybody, so she took on jobs taking care of elderly Americans in their last sickness. And she did that for many, many years. And she did not take an apartment for me or with me, and I was put into a residence club in Brooklyn, where I stayed for at least 6 years. For 6 years, I worked in a residence club, and I went to high school during that period. And my mother lived with whatever case she had taken on. She lived with the people whom she was taking care of, like a practical nurse. And I saw very little of my mother during that entire period. Hardly ever. She didn't have a home, but she was not interested in having a home and having me as a burden around her neck. I would see her maybe every 2 weeks for 2 hours, 3 hours. I had to make my own friends. My relatives were nice to me, but my mother was very hard and very cruel. Now that I think about it, she was bereaved, and she didn't know how to handle it. And I wasn't much help to her, and we never really did get along very well. It was okay as long as my father was the buffer between two of us. But with him gone, there was very little relationship, very small relationship with my mother. But that's the kind of person she was. She was not very warm. I was in Omaha, Nebraska in 1941 in December when Pearl Harbor happened. And that was very exciting. And I was politically pretty naive, but I knew that if the Americans were to join the Allies, we might have a chance of getting rid of the Germans, and I was exuberant. And everybody looked at me as though I'd gone crazy because they said, we're going to send our husbands and our sons to get rid of your Hitler. And I could not understand why they weren't more enthusiastic as me. And as far as the war end is concerned, I was living in Brooklyn and celebrating on Times Square when it was over. For I spent those years. Then I went to high school, and I graduated in Brooklyn. Then I went to Brooklyn College in the evening. I went to City College of New York in the evening, but I didn't really get a degree until I came to California. And then I met my husband, Manfred. His background was very similar to mine. His parents came over. They were prosperous fruit merchants in Leipzig. They also didn't come exactly in time, but they came in 1939 and settled in Manhattan, in Washington Heights, with their furniture. And my husband and his brother had to support them. My husband was 16 and his brother was 19, and those two boys supported their parents completely. So as I said, we were quite adventurous and we decided to go to California. Just like that, we were pioneers. So we ran San Francisco for 1 year, doing all kinds of jobs, until my husband, who had started college in City College in New York, decided that he really needed to complete a degree in order to at any time get anywhere in America. And we discovered Berkeley. He went to school here for about 1.5 years and got his education. And then we settled in Berkeley permanently.
Hannah and Manfred lived in Berkeley for the rest of their lives, with the exception of 4 years spent in Paris in the late 50s, where Manfred worked as an accountant for the US Army. They lived through many interesting times. Hannah started out being a French teacher, but later went to San Francisco State, where she got a degree in comparative literature, and after that became an ESL teacher for many decades. Manfred died in October 2003, and Hannah followed him in January 2011.